The slap landed so hard the coffee in Ethan Cross's hand rippled to the rim, but he didn't spill a drop. Inside Millie's diner, wedged between a hardware store and a shuttered movie theater in Ridge Hollow, Colorado, the late-day crowd went silent beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt bacon. Farmers in mud-caked boots stared into their plates. A waitress froze mid-step. No one moved. In this town, power wore steel-toed boots and drank before dinner. Ethan stood there in grease-stained denim and a faded flannel, tall, broad, unshaken. A thin red mark bloomed across his cheek, but his gray eyes stayed level, empty in a way that wasn't weakness. It was calculation. He looked like a mechanic. He moved like something else. "Hit me again," the drunk sneered, puffing up for the room. "Let's see what you got." Ethan's voice was low, steady enough to cut glass. "You don't want that." Across the diner, Charlotte Bennett, tailored coat, diamond watch, wealth that could buy the entire block, watched the exchange and felt it immediately. This wasn't fear holding him still. It was control. The kind forged in places where hesitation meant death. The room thought they were watching a man swallow humiliation. They were wrong. They were watching a fuse burn. And when it reached the end, Ridge Hollow would never be the same. If stories about hidden strength and unexpected justice move you, like this video and subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales. The sound of the slap did more than echo. It divided the room. One half of Millie's diner held its breath. The other half pretended not to notice. Ethan Cross felt the sting bloom across his cheek, felt the faint metallic taste of blood where his teeth clipped the inside of his lip. The coffee in his hand trembled once, then steadied. He did not touch his face. He did not step back. He did not give the room what it expected. Derek wanted noise. Ethan gave him silence. Around them, forks hovered midair. A mother tightened her grip on her child's shoulder. Two ranch hands stared into their plates like witnesses who had learned survival meant invisibility. In Ridge Hollow, conflict wasn't confronted. It was endured. Derek thrived on that endurance. "You gonna cry about it?" Derek barked, spreading his arms as if the diner were his stage. "Or you finally gonna act like a man?" The words were meant to shrink him. They didn't. Ethan lifted his eyes slowly. There was no anger in them. That was what unsettled Charlotte Bennett the most. Anger would have been ordinary. What she saw instead was distance, calculation, the kind of stillness that didn't come from fear. It came from control earned the hardest way possible. Derek stepped closer, invading space with the confidence of someone who had never paid for his cruelty. "Say something," he pushed. "Or you just good at hiding behind that kid of yours." That landed. Not because it hurt Ethan's pride, but because it mentioned Lily. Charlotte saw it, the shift subtle but seismic. The air around him changed. Not explosive. Not volatile. Focused. Ethan set his coffee down carefully on the counter. He aligned it with the edge as if precision still mattered. As if order could exist in chaos. "Walk away," Ethan said. Not loud. Not dramatic. Final. Derek laughed again, but it faltered at the edges. "You don't tell me what to do." He shoved Ethan in the chest. Hard. The kind of shove meant to provoke reaction. To draw blood or pride or both. Ethan absorbed it. Boots planted. Spine straight. No stumble. No retreat. Derek swung. It was wide and ugly. Fueled by ego, not training. Ethan moved before the fist fully extended. 6 inches left. 2 inches forward. His hand rose, caught Derek's wrist mid-arc. Not with force. With inevitability. The twist that followed was swift and surgical. Derek's momentum betrayed him. His body rotated. His balance vanished. The thud against tile silenced the room more completely than the slap had. Ethan didn't slam him. He guided him down. One knee pressed into Derek's shoulder blade. Wrist angled precisely. Just enough pressure to suggest consequences. Not enough to cause permanent damage. Control. Absolute control. Derek grunted, struggling, face burning red with humiliation instead of pain. Get off me, he barked. Ethan leaned slightly closer, voice low enough that only Derek could hear, but the tension carried anyway. You don't get to touch me, he said quietly. You don't get to scare my daughter. And you don't get to run this town with your fists. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary. Derek thrashed again. Ethan adjusted pressure, a fraction. The kind of adjustment that reminded a man how fragile joints truly were. Derek sucked in air through clenched teeth. Across the room, Charlotte felt her pulse hammer in her throat. She had seen men negotiate billion-dollar deals. She had seen senators posture on live television. She had never seen power expressed like this. Not loud, not theatrical, unshakable. Derek's friends stepped forward, uncertain. Ethan didn't look at them. If you take one more step, he said evenly, you're part of this. The way he said it made the choice obvious. They stopped. And something remarkable happened in that stillness. The diner shifted. People who had kept their eyes down lifted them. A rancher in the corner muttered, "About time." It wasn't approval of violence. It was relief. Relief that someone had finally refused to bend. Derek's strength had always relied on spectators who looked away. Now they were looking directly at him. Pinned, powerless, small. Ethan held him there just long enough for the message to settle into bone. Then he released him. Not abruptly. Deliberately. Derek scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, pride shredded. His eyes darted around the diner, searching for allegiance. He found none. You think this makes you a hero? Derek spat. Ethan picked up his coffee again. No, he said calmly. It makes me done. That word, done, landed harder than the takedown. Done tolerating. Done absorbing. Done letting a bully write the rules. The sheriff's cruiser lights flashed red and blue against the diner windows minutes later. Someone had called. Derek tried to rewrite the narrative before Deputy Carter even stepped inside. He attacked me, but the room no longer cooperated with lies. He swung first, Deb said from behind the counter, voice steady. Others nodded. 6 witnesses. Unwavering. The deputy looked from Derek's flushed face to Ethan's unmarked posture. Turn around, Carter said. The click of handcuffs echoed like punctuation. Derek resisted verbally. Threatened lawsuits, muttered about connections, but his voice had lost its volume. It carried the brittle edge of a man who realized the room had changed sides. As he was led out, he locked eyes with Ethan. Rage simmered there. So did something else. Fear. Because for the first time, Derek understood a truth that bullies rarely confront. Strength doesn't shout. Wait. Charlotte watched Ethan as the cruiser pulled away. He didn't celebrate. He didn't posture. He exhaled once, like a man who had held his breath for years. And in that quiet release, Charlotte felt something shift inside herself too. This wasn't just about a diner fight. This was about a man who refused to let his daughter grow up believing intimidation was normal. This was about a town remembering its spine. And somewhere beneath the fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee, a line had been drawn. Not in anger. In dignity. The room slowly returned to motion. Plates clinked. Conversations resumed, softer now, thoughtful. But nothing felt the same. Because everyone in that diner had witnessed it. The moment power changed hands. And none of them would forget it. The cruiser's taillights disappeared at the end of Main Street, but the quiet that followed did not feel like peace. Felt like aftershock. Millie's diner resumed its rhythm. Coffee poured, plates cleared, chairs dragged across tile, but every glance toward Ethan carried a different weight now. Not curiosity. Not fear. Respect. Ethan didn't bask in it. He paid his bill in cash, left a folded tip beneath the saucer, and stepped outside into air sharp with mountain chill. The sky had shifted toward evening, streaked in copper and blue, as if the day itself had absorbed what had happened. Charlotte followed a few seconds later. You didn't humiliate him, she said, stopping a few feet away. Ethan looked at the horizon rather than at her. That wasn't the goal. He won't see it that way. No, Ethan agreed quietly. He won't. And that was the part that unsettled her. Derek wasn't finished. Men like him didn't process shame, they redirected it. Across the street, 2 pickup trucks idled longer than necessary. Conversations lingered in lowered tones. Word was already spreading beyond the diner walls. In a town this size, reputation moved faster than signal. You should be careful, Charlotte said. Ethan glanced at her then, not dismissive, not amused, measured. I'm always careful. That didn't look like careful. That was controlled. There was a difference. Charlotte understood that difference instinctively. She had lived her life in rooms where aggression wore tailored suits and threats arrived disguised as partnership. What she had just witnessed wasn't loss of composure. It was containment. Still, something darker simmered beneath it. A black SUV turned the corner and rolled slowly past them. Tinted windows. Out-of-town plates. Charlotte felt it immediately, the calculation behind the glass. Ethan saw it too. He didn't react outwardly. But his shoulders shifted, subtle tension tightening across muscle and bone. Do you know them? She asked. No. But he didn't look convinced. The SUV parked 2 storefronts down. Doors opened. 2 men stepped out, clean shoes on gravel, tailored jackets too polished for Ridge Hollow's dust. They weren't ranchers. They weren't locals. They were investors. The taller one scanned the street before his gaze settled on Ethan's garage across from the diner. Then he noticed Ethan standing there, and smiled. Not warmly, strategically. The men crossed the street. Charlotte recognized the firm stitched in subtle embroidery along one cuff. Crestwell Development Group. She had seen their acquisition proposals in Denver boardrooms. Aggressive expansion. Ruthless leverage. Ridge Hollow wasn't a random stop. It was a target. Mr. Cross, the taller man said smoothly as he approached. We've been hoping to speak with you. Ethan didn't offer his hand. You've made your offer. Yes, and we were hoping you might reconsider. My answer hasn't changed. The shorter man spoke this time, voice silk over steel. It might. Projects evolve. Pressure does too. Charlotte watched Ethan's face. No flare of temper. No defensive posture. Just quiet refusal. My property isn't for sale, he repeated. The taller man's smile tightened. We're prepared to escalate. On what grounds? Charlotte asked, stepping forward before she could stop herself. Both men turned toward her. Recognition flickered. Charlotte Bennett, the shorter one said slowly. This is unexpected. Business often is. Ethan glanced sideways at her, but said nothing. The taller man cleared his throat. This is a private matter. It becomes public when intimidation enters the equation, Charlotte replied evenly. We're not intimidating anyone. You arrived minutes after a physical altercation involving a subcontractor connected to your firm, she said. Her voice level but unmistakably firm. That's either coincidence or coordination. The air thickened. Ethan remained still beside her, but Charlotte could feel the question forming in his silence. Derek hadn't just been drunk. He had been useful. The shorter developer folded his hands. Mr. Cross's land sits in the center of a redevelopment plan that will bring jobs and revenue to this town. His resistance complicates that. Your definition of development seems to rely heavily on pressure, Charlotte replied. The taller man's smile vanished. Careful, Ms. Bennett. She held his gaze. You're currently bidding on a federal infrastructure contract tied to my company's advisory recommendations. Beep. You wouldn't, he said quietly. I would advise transparency, she corrected. Silence stretched long enough for wind to move dust across the pavement. Ethan's voice cut through it. This conversation's over. The developers studied him. Studied Charlotte. Calculated. Then stepped back. We'll revisit this, the shorter one said. They returned to the SUV without another word. When the vehicle pulled away, the street felt different. Not safer. Suppose. Charlotte turned to Ethan. You knew. I suspected. How long? 6 months. 6 months of quiet offers. 6 months of polite refusal. 6 months of mounting pressure disguised as opportunity. And Derek, she asked, works one of their satellite contracts. So it wasn't about pride. It was about leverage. Charlotte exhaled slowly. They were testing you. They were measuring how far I'd bend. And now they know I don't. He didn't sound triumphant. He sounded prepared. Truck door slammed down the block. A woman stepped out of a grocery store and waved at Ethan with something like relief in her eyes. The town had seen the developers too. They weren't invisible. They were simply strategic. You can't fight corporations the way you fight men in diners, Charlotte said quietly. Ethan looked at his garage across the street. I don't intend to fight, he replied. I intend to stay. That simple. That immovable. Charlotte felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not admiration exactly. Something steadier. Conviction. They'll come at you differently next time, she said. I know. And if they try to squeeze you through permits, zoning, taxes. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Then I'll deal with it. He meant alone. That part unsettled her more than the confrontation had. The next morning, the pressure arrived precisely as predicted. An inspection notice. Code compliance review. Environmental impact reassessment. All legal. All sudden. Deb from the diner crossed the street before noon, holding a folded paper in her hand. They're reviewing half the block, she said quietly. Not just you. Course they were. Spread the pressure. Create division. Force cooperation. But something had changed in Ridge Hollow. Instead of whispering, people gathered. The hardware store owner walked over. Then the barber. Then 2 ranchers who had kept their eyes down the day before. They're not pushing him out, the barber muttered. They won't push any of us, Deb added. Ethan stood in the center of it, silent, absorbing. Not attention. Support. Charlotte watched from the edge of the group. This wasn't about one garage anymore. It was about identity. About a town deciding whether growth meant surrender. By late afternoon, a council meeting was scheduled. Open forum. Public record. Crestwell sent representatives. Polished presentations. Projected revenue. Job forecast. But the room wasn't buying numbers. They were remembering the diner. Remembering the slap. Remembering who swung first. When Ethan finally stood to speak, the room quieted instantly. I don't oppose progress, he said calmly. I oppose being cornered into it. No theatrics. No emotional plea. Just truth. If your plan requires breaking the people who live here, he continued, it isn't development. It's displacement. The words landed harder than statistics. Charlotte watched council members exchange glances. Momentum was shifting. The developers tried to regain footing, offered incentives, softened language, promised collaboration. But Ridge Hollow had felt their edge already. Trust once broken doesn't rebuild on slideshows. By the end of the meeting, permits were postponed pending review. Audits were requested. Crestwell's timeline fractured. Outside the town hall, the developers stepped aside near their SUV, voices tight with frustration. Charlotte walked past them without breaking stride. You've complicated this, the taller one said under his breath. No, she replied softly. You did. She didn't stop walking. Behind her, Ethan stood near the steps, hands in his jacket pockets, gaze steady on the mountains beyond town. The fight had shifted arenas. From fists to filings. From ego to endurance. And Ridge Hollow was still standing. As Charlotte approached him, the sky deepened into twilight. They won't quit, she said. I don't expect them to. She studied his profile. The faint bruise along his cheekbone already fading. You didn't start this. No, he agreed. But I'll finish it. There was no bravado in the statement. Only resolve. The kind that outlasts intimidation. The kind that builds instead of destroys. Charlotte realized then that the diner had been a spark. What followed was fire, but not the reckless kind. The controlled kind. The kind that clears land without burning it to ash. And somewhere in the gathering dark, Ridge Hollow was choosing what it wanted to become. Not because of a billionaire. Not because of a development firm. But because one man had refused to bend. And the town had decided to stand with him. The postponement of Crestwell's permits did not end the conflict. It refined it. For a few days, Ridge Hollow felt almost victorious. People lingered longer on sidewalks. Conversations held a current of pride instead of caution. The council's decision had sent a signal. This town could not be steamrolled quietly. But corporations rarely retreat in anger. They retreat to strategize. 3 mornings later, Ethan unlocked his garage to find a certified letter taped neatly to the metal door. No threats, no raised voices. Just legal language dense enough to suffocate a man's livelihood. Environmental compliance review. Property tax reassessment. Liability audit tied to commercial zoning adjustments. All perfectly lawful. All expensive. Charlotte stood beside him as he scanned the pages, jaw tightening by degrees rather than snapping outright. "They're not trying to scare you anymore," she said softly. "They're trying to bleed me," Ethan replied. It was a different kind of attack. Quiet, procedural, impersonal. It didn't involve shouting or fists. It involved time, money, fatigue. And fatigue was far more dangerous. Across the street, 2 trucks slowed deliberately as they passed the garage. Not threatening, just watching. Ridge Hollow had chosen a side in the open. Crestwell would respond behind closed doors. Ethan folded the documents carefully and set them on his desk inside the small office that smelled faintly of oil and paper. The room suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher than usual. "You don't have to handle this alone," Charlotte said. He looked at her then, not defensive, guarded. "I've been handling things alone for a long time. That doesn't make it sustainable." Silence lingered between them, but not the awkward kind. The heavy kind. The kind filled with unspoken history. Outside, a battered Ford pulled into the lot. Mrs. Patterson stepped out, clutching her purse. "I heard about the inspection," she said before Ethan could greet her. "My nephew works in county records. They're pulling files on every independent shop in town. Not just yours." That changed the shape of it. This wasn't surgical pressure. It was collective leverage. "They're making examples," Charlotte murmured. Mrs. Patterson squared her shoulders. "Then we won't let them." Word spread faster than paperwork. By noon, 3 other shop owners had gathered in Ethan's office. Barber, hardware supplier, a local contractor unaffiliated with Crestwell. They laid their letters on the desk like cards in a high-stakes game. Different wording. Same message. Compliance scrutiny. Reassessment. Review. "They want us scrambling," the barber muttered. "Make us desperate enough to sell." Ethan listened more than he spoke. Charlotte watched him carefully. He wasn't angry. He was calculating again, but differently this time. This wasn't about ending a fight in seconds. This was about endurance. "What if we don't scramble?" Charlotte said quietly. All eyes shifted toward her. "What if we respond collectively instead of individually?" The hardware store owner frowned. "How?" "With representation," she said. "Shared counsel. Shared resources. Shared strategy." "You think lawyers scare corporations?" the contractor asked. "No," Charlotte replied evenly. "But exposure does." The room grew quiet. She continued. "Crestwell's development portfolio depends on public perception, municipal goodwill, state partnerships. If a small mountain town pushes back collectively and makes noise about coercive tactics, that noise travels." Ethan studied her. "You're talking about escalation. I'm talking about balance." He weighed that, then nodded once. "All right," he said. "We do it together." It was the first time he used that word out loud. Together. Within 48 hours, Ridge Hollow's independent business owners retained a regional legal firm known for aggressive transparency cases. The initial filing wasn't dramatic. It simply requested documentation, communication trails, timing patterns, financial incentives tied to zoning revisions. Paper against paper. But it changed the rhythm. Crestwell's next move came quicker than expected. Derek returned. Not drunk, not loud. Dressed in pressed jeans and a clean button-down, posture rigid as if coached. He entered the garage mid-afternoon, sunlight cutting sharp lines across the concrete floor. Ethan looked up from beneath a lifted hood, wiped his hands slowly on a rag. "What do you want?" Derek didn't answer immediately. His gaze scanned the space as if evaluating value rather than memory. "You should have sold when they offered," he said finally. "Still not interested? You think they're just gonna stop?" "I think you're not here to negotiate," Ethan replied. Derek's jaw flexed. "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed yourself." The words were calm, accurate, and they landed deeper than any insult. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They're cutting me loose. My contracts, my backing. They're blaming me for the heat." Charlotte, standing near the office doorway, felt the shift. Derek wasn't posturing. He was unraveling. "They used you," she said quietly. Derek shot her a glare. "Don't. It's true." He looked back at Ethan, and something unfamiliar flickered there. Not rage. Not dominance. Fear. "You think you won," Derek muttered. "You don't know what they're capable of." Ethan stepped forward. Not aggressively, not defensively. Just enough to close the distance. "I know exactly what they're capable of," he said. "That's why I won't sell." Derek's composure cracked for a second. "They'll crush you," he whispered. "Maybe," Ethan replied. "But not quietly." That word again. Quietly. Derek's shoulders sagged in a way Charlotte had never seen before. Without the backing of Crestwell, without the illusion of invincibility, he looked smaller, less certain. "They're freezing my credit," he said finally. "I'm finished." There it was. Consequences. Not theatrical, not immediate, but real. "You helped them pressure people," Ethan said. Derek swallowed. "They said it was progress. And you believed them." "I believed they wouldn't turn on me." A long silence filled the garage. For the first time, Derek understood something that Ethan had known from the beginning. Power borrowed from someone else can be revoked without warning. "They're abandoning you," Charlotte said gently. "The way they plan to abandon this town." Derek's eyes dropped. Humiliation was no longer loud. It was internal. "What do you want?" Ethan asked. Derek hesitated, then exhaled. "I kept copies," he said. "Emails. Payment structures. Internal memos." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken. "Why?" "Insurance. Insurance against betrayal." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive, placing it carefully on the edge of Ethan's workbench. "They said I was disposable," Derek said. "I don't like being disposable." Ethan stared at the drive. This wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was survival instinct meeting consequence. "You understand," Ethan said slowly, "that helping now doesn't erase what you've done." "I know," Derek replied. That honesty, thin but present, shifted something. Not trust. Not yet. But leverage. Charlotte picked up the flash drive and slipped it into her bag. "We'll verify it," she said. Derek nodded once and turned toward the door. He paused before stepping outside. "For what it's worth," he muttered without looking back, "I shouldn't have hit you." Ethan didn't respond. But he didn't need to. The apology hung in the space between them. Raw, imperfect, real. When Derek left, the garage felt heavier and lighter at the same time. "You believe him?" Charlotte asked. "I believe he's scared," Ethan replied. "That's enough." That evening, Charlotte opened the files on her laptop. Emails outlining pressure vectors. Language about isolating resistance. references to strategic intimidation. It wasn't subtle. It was documented. By morning, Crestwell's carefully polished image had fractures running through it. The legal firm moved swiftly, filing a formal complaint with state regulators and copying several journalists known for investigative reporting on rural land acquisition practices. The narrative flipped. Not because of emotion, because of evidence. By the end of the week, Crestwell's regional VP issued a public statement citing miscommunication and withdrawal from the Ridge Hollow initiative. Contracts dissolved. Permits abandoned. The SUV never returned. Ridge Hollow wasn't just standing. It was intact. And Derek, he lost his largest contracts. His credit lines froze exactly as he feared. But he wasn't arrested again. He wasn't publicly destroyed. He was left to rebuild without intimidation as a crutch. Consequences tailored to fit. One evening, as Charlotte stood beside Ethan outside the garage, the sun dipping low over the mountains, she asked quietly, "Do you regret not breaking his arm?" Ethan considered the fading light. "No," he said. "Breaking it would have been easy. And this." He looked at the town. People walking freely, storefronts open, voices unguarded. "This took longer," he replied. "But it lasts." Charlotte felt something settle deep in her chest. Not victory. Not relief. Respect. The diner had been a spark. The corporate pressure had been fuel. But what endured wasn't dominance. It was dignity reinforced by community. Ethan turned the key in the shop door and pocketed it. "They'll think twice before trying this again," she said. "They'll try somewhere else," he answered. "That's not your burden." "No," he agreed. "But here. It's handled. Handled without theatrics. Without vengeance. Without spectacle. Handled in a way that reshaped more than one man's reputation. It reshaped a town's posture. And as the first porch lights flickered on across Ridge Hollow, Charlotte understood that what she had witnessed wasn't just strength. It was restraint with purpose. And that was far more powerful than fear. Crestwell's withdrawal should have felt like the end. Didn't. It felt like a pause before consequences finished unfolding. For a few quiet days, Ridge Hollow breathed easier. Trucks rolled past Ethan's garage without slowing. Conversations at Millie's returned to weather and cattle prices instead of legal filings. The mountains stood unchanged, indifferent and steady. But the damage Crestwell left behind wasn't only structural. It was human. Derek had lost more than contracts. He had lost his audience. And for a man who built his identity on dominance, silence can be unbearable. Started with whispers, then unpaid suppliers, then a foreclosed equipment loan. Charlotte heard about it from the same barber who had stood in Ethan's office weeks earlier. "He's selling off tools," the barber muttered, almost conflicted. "Nobody wants to hire him." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He adjusted the torque wrench in his hand, focused on the alignment of bolts as if metal made more sense than men. "He made his choices," Ethan said finally. "He did," Charlotte agreed. But her voice held something else, awareness that consequences, when real, rarely feel cinematic. 2 evenings later, as Ethan was closing the shop, Derek appeared again. Not in pressed clothes. Not with arrogance. Just tired. He stood near the edge of the lot like someone unsure whether he was allowed to approach. Ethan didn't move toward him. He waited. Derek walked closer, boots dragging slightly across gravel. "I'm not here to start anything," he said. "I know." It wasn't a challenge. It was recognition. Derek looked different in the fading light. Less rigid, less inflated. His eyes held something stripped bare. "They froze everything," he admitted. "Credit. Contracts. Even the county pulled my bonding license after those emails surfaced." He didn't blame Ethan. He didn't blame Charlotte. He understood cause and effect now. "You knew they'd turn on you," Ethan said. "I didn't think they'd do it this fast." Ethan met his gaze evenly. "That's how leverage works." Derek swallowed hard. I thought I was the one applying pressure. You were, Charlotte said quietly from behind them. Just not in the way you thought. A long silence stretched between the three of them. This wasn't triumph. It was reckoning. Derek's hands flexed at his sides. You could have ruined me completely, he said to Ethan. You had the chance. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. I wasn't trying to ruin you. Could have fooled me. I was trying to stop you. That landed differently. Derek shifted his weight, shame surfacing in his expression. I shouldn't have touched you. No, Ethan agreed. And I shouldn't have dragged your kid into it. That sentence hung heavier than any other. Ethan's posture changed. Not aggressive but firm. You don't get to involve her, he said, voice low and final. I know. Derek's voice cracked slightly on the word. He wasn't performing now. He was confronting himself. I grew up thinking loud meant strong, Derek muttered. My old man used to say if you're not feared, you're nothing. Ethan listened without interruption. But I saw something different that day, Derek continued. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't chase me after I went down. You didn't try to make a show of it. He looked up. You could have hurt me worse. Ethan's eyes were steady. I didn't need to. That truth cut deeper than humiliation, because it reframed everything Derek believed about power. I don't know how to fix what I broke, Derek admitted. You don't fix it with words, Ethan replied. How then? Ethan paused. Start by not breaking anything else. Simple, direct, uncompromising. Derek nodded slowly. I'm selling the rest of my equipment, he said. Gonna clear the debt. Might head north. Fresh start. Ethan didn't offer encouragement. He didn't offer condemnation either. He simply acknowledged the path. That's your call. Derek looked around the garage one last time. You know, I thought you were weak for not fighting back harder. And now, I think I didn't understand what strong actually looks like. For the first time since the diner, there was no edge in his voice, just acceptance. He turned and walked away, not hurried, not defeated, just finished. Charlotte watched him go, then looked at Ethan. You didn't forgive him. No, you didn't punish him either. Ethan leaned against the workbench, exhaustion finally surfacing in his shoulders. Life's punishing him enough. That was the difference. He didn't need vengeance. Reality had done the work. Over the next week, Ridge Hollow adjusted. The barber hired 2 apprentices. The hardware store expanded its backroom inventory. Mrs. Patterson organized a town potluck, just because. People didn't speak about Crestwell much anymore. They spoke about staying, about protecting, about rebuilding trust. And Ethan. He became quieter in a different way. Not withdrawn, huddled. Charlotte noticed it in the way he lingered after closing the shop, watching Lily draw chalk patterns on the pavement outside. You don't look over your shoulder anymore, she said one evening. I never stopped looking, he corrected gently. I just don't expect trouble around every corner now. That subtle shift, less hyper-alert, more present, mattered. Not because Derek was gone, but because Ethan no longer carried the weight of unresolved confrontation. The fight had been necessary. The aftermath had been instructive. But what endured was something deeper, clarity. One Saturday morning, Ridge Hollow held its annual fall market earlier than usual. Booths lined Main Street. Kids ran between tables selling baked goods and handmade crafts. Ethan stood near his garage, helping Lily hang a small sign she had painted. Cross Auto, we fix what others break. Charlotte laughed when she saw it. That's accurate, she said. Lily grinned proudly. As townspeople drifted past, more than a few paused to shake Ethan's hand. Not because he had fought, because he had stood. A retired veteran approached him quietly. Didn't see it at first, the man said. But I recognize that kind of restraint. Ethan inclined his head slightly. It's learned. And hard-earned, the veteran replied. Charlotte caught the exchange from a few steps away. The town didn't celebrate violence. It respected control. That distinction mattered. As the afternoon sun dipped low and music drifted from the small stage near the courthouse, Charlotte stepped closer to Ethan. "You changed something here," she said. He shook his head lightly. "It was already here. You just reminded them." He didn't respond, but the faint curve at the edge of his mouth suggested he understood. Later that night, after the booths had packed up and Main Street returned to quiet, Ethan locked the shop and walked toward his truck with Lily perched on his shoulders. Charlotte fell into step beside them. "You think it's over?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced up at the stars beginning to emerge above the mountains. "The conflict?" he asked. "Yes." He considered it. "It's never really over," he said. "Not in a world where power likes shortcuts." She nodded. "But here," he added, gesturing subtly toward the town. "Here it's settled." And it was. Not because a bully was crushed. Not because a corporation retreated. But because a community had drawn a line and meant it. As they reached the truck, Lily leaned down and whispered something into Ethan's ear. He smiled, a rare, unguarded smile. "What did she say?" Charlotte asked. "She said I don't look tired anymore." Charlotte felt her chest tighten slightly, because that was the truest measure of victory. Not headlines, not legal wins. Is earned. And visible in the eyes of a child who finally felt safe. Ethan opened the truck door and helped Lily climb inside. Charlotte watched him move, steady, deliberate, unhurried. The slap in the diner felt like a lifetime ago. But its echo had reshaped everything. Not through spectacle, through consequence. And in Ridge Hollow, that consequence had done what brute force never could. It restored balance. Autumn thinned into winter without asking permission. Cold air swept down from the mountains and settled over Ridge Hollow, sharpening the outlines of rooftops and turning breath into small clouds that vanished as quickly as they formed. Life returned to its predictable rhythm. Engines repaired, coffee poured, school buses rumbling down Main Street before sunrise. But beneath the ordinary hum, something had changed permanently. Not with different representatives. Not under a revised name. They withdrew from 3 additional rural bids across the state within weeks of the Ridge Hollow complaint going public. A regional business journal picked up the story quietly at first. Acquisition firm faces transparency review. But investigative reporters followed the thread Derek had provided. Emails became headlines. Internal memos surfaced. Language about pressure application and isolate resistance nodes circulated online. State regulators opened a broader inquiry. Charlotte didn't celebrate when she saw the news. She simply forwarded the article to Ethan with a single line. "It spreads." By the time snow touched the sidewalks in December, Crestwell's regional vice president had resigned. Their board announced restructuring. Investors demanded explanation. The machine that once felt untouchable now stood exposed. Not destroyed, but forced to reckon with its methods. In Ridge Hollow that mattered. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. And it felt different. One evening, Ethan locked up the shop and found Lily sitting on the tailgate of his truck, boots swinging above frozen gravel. "You coming?" she asked. "In a minute." She studied him carefully, the way children do when they're measuring something deeper than words. "You don't look like you're waiting for a fight anymore," she said. He paused. 'Cause she was right. 4 years. Long before Derek, long before Crestwell, Ethan had lived braced. Muscles coiled. Mind scanning for threats no one else could see. It had followed him home from places most people only watched on screens. It had followed him into grocery stores, into quiet evenings, into sleep. But lately, the tension had eased. Not vanished, but softened. "I'm not," he admitted. She smiled, satisfied, and hopped down from the tailgate. Inside the house that night, as snow tapped lightly against the windows, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with paperwork spread in front of him. Not compliance notices this time, not legal letters. Expansion permits. The town council had approached him with a proposal. A vocational partnership. A small training program attached to his garage. Apprenticeships for local high school graduates who didn't want to leave town but needed skills beyond seasonal work. He hadn't sought it. It had grown naturally from respect. Charlotte stood by the counter, reading through the proposal again. "They trust you," she said quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I didn't ask for that." "You didn't have to." He looked at the papers. Training bays. Tool grants. Community investment funds. "They're offering funding," she added. "Not loans. Grants." He exhaled slowly. The diner incident had begun as humiliation. Had become resistance. Now it was turning into opportunity. That was the part no one predicted. "You know what this means," Charlotte said. "It means more responsibility. It means you're shaping the town's future." He didn't answer immediately. Responsibility he understood. Leadership he had avoided. But Ridge Hollow wasn't asking for a hero. It was asking for steadiness. And that he could give. Across town, Derek packed the last of his equipment into a rented trailer under a gray sky. No crowd gathered. No one jeered. He left quietly. But not empty-handed. Before departing, he walked into the town hall and signed a formal affidavit detailing Crestwell's internal tactics, one final step in sealing the investigation. It didn't erase his behavior. It didn't restore his reputation overnight. But it drew a line between who he had been and who he intended to become. Deputy Carter watched him leave town without cuffs this time. "That's enough," the deputy muttered to himself. Consequences had been delivered. Balance restored. Back in Ridge Hollow, the training program launched in early spring. 3 young men and 1 woman stood awkwardly inside Ethan's garage on the first day, uncertain but eager. Ethan addressed them without flourish. "You'll learn discipline first," he said. "Skill comes after." They nodded. Not intimidated. Focused. Charlotte watched from the doorway, warmth in her expression. The town gathered later that afternoon for a modest ribbon cutting. No stage, no spectacle. Just neighbors. Deb from the diner brought coffee. Mrs. Patterson baked pies. The barber closed early. As Ethan cut the ribbon with a pair of worn shop shears, applause rose. Not thunderous but genuine. And in that sound was something stronger than triumph. Security. Ridge Hollow had not been bought. It had not been fractured. It had chosen itself. Months later, a letter arrived addressed to Ethan. No return name. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I'm working construction in Idaho. No shortcuts this time. E." Ethan folded the letter without comment and placed it in a drawer. He didn't dwell on it. He didn't resent it either. Some battles end with explosions. Others end with quiet departures. Both can be final. One evening near the end of summer, Charlotte stood beside Ethan on the hill overlooking town. The garage lights glowed below. Laughter drifted faintly upward. "You realize this started with a slap," she said. He nodded. "It ended with a foundation." He looked out across Ridge Hollow, storefronts intact, children riding bikes along sidewalks once shadowed by uncertainty. "No," he corrected gently. "It started long before that." She turned toward him. The slap just made it visible. That was the truth. The fight hadn't been about ego, had been about boundaries, about refusing to let fear define a community, about teaching a daughter that strength doesn't require cruelty. Charlotte slipped her hand into his. "You didn't just win," she said softly. "You built something." Ethan watched the sunset stretch gold across the mountains. Winning fades. Building remains. In the distance, the garage door rolled down for the night, one of the apprentices locking up under Ethan's instruction. The town didn't need a savior. Needed an example. And when pressure came, when intimidation knocked loudly, Ridge Hollow remembered the day someone chose dignity over dominance. That memory held. The corporation that tried to force its will faced investigation and financial loss. The bully who mistook volume for strength learned that borrowed power collapses. And the man who could have broken bones chose instead to fortify roots. That is what endured. That is what satisfied. Because justice didn't arrive in a single blow. It unfolded in consequences. Settled into systems. It reshaped a town's spine. And when the wind moved through Ridge Hollow now, it carried no tension. Only the steady sound of a place that had stood its ground. And won. By the time spring settled over Ridge Hollow again, the air felt different. Not because the mountains had changed, but because the people beneath them had. What began as a single moment of public disrespect had quietly reshaped the town's future. The garage lights now stayed on a little later, not from pressure but from purpose. Young hands learned steady work under Ethan's guidance, and for the first time in years, he wasn't bracing for the next blow. He was building something that would outlast one. Derek's shadow no longer lingered on Main Street. Crestwell's name faded from local conversation, replaced by talk of expansion plans rooted in local hands. No grand speeches marked the shift. It showed in smaller ways. Neighbors lingering longer, business owners standing taller, Lily laughing without glancing over her shoulder. Ethan never called it victory. He simply kept showing up, steady and present, proving that truth does not need volume to prevail. What changed him most wasn't the confrontation. It was realizing he no longer had to carry everything alone. Strength, he learned, isn't about overpowering others. It's about protecting what matters without becoming what you oppose. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, Ethan watched the apprentices lock up the shop, their silhouettes framed in amber light. Lily slipped her hand into his and said, "It feels safe here." He nodded. "'Cause now it truly was. If this story moved you, like and share it with someone who believes in standing their ground. And subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales to help us keep telling stories where courage builds something lasting.